Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, today we've got a really exciting episode for you. Sorry, Derek and I have just been having a few giggles because it's actually on the regulatory drivers for ISO 22716. Before you switch off, just to explain, 22716 is a cosmetics manufacturing standard. We had a conversation during the last episode on the ISO Show about this particular standard, but I did mention very briefly that this standard is quite unique in that there are some major regulatory drivers behind it. So we couldn't talk about ISO 22716 without going into detail on what those regulatory drivers are. So welcome back, Derek.
Thank you, Mel. Yes, regulatory drivers and the relationship with other ISO standards. That's what I want to talk about now.
Yeah, so the main one being the EU directive. Now, some of our listeners will be thinking, well, Brexit's been done now. We're out of Europe. Is this still applicable? And the answer is actually, yes, it is. So, as you're probably aware, although the UK left Europe, many of the EU directives still apply because we've adopted them. We want to keep them because we're involved in the creation of them, and they were created for a very good reason. And this one in particular is one that is definitely staying. So what is this regulation? Well, why have it? Or Derek is going to explain a lot more about it, but just to give it some context, this particular regulation, which is number 1223, 2009, is aimed at streamlining, and that the whole intent was to modernise current legislation in place across Europe, specifically in relation to cosmetics. And you might be thinking, well, is that just makeup? Well, actually, no, it's covering a much wider range of products than that. So it's everyday hygiene products that we all use, such as soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorants, right through to the top-end luxury beauty items, such as makeup and perfumes, which are obviously high-end, in some cases, very expensive products. And all of these products are now regulated at a European level, which is to ensure that we can guarantee consumer safety and to secure an internal market for cosmetics. So it's absolutely critical for anybody trading within Europe that they've got a GMP in place, a general manufacturing practice, that's in alignment with ISO 22716. So hopefully that's provided a bit of context, and I'm now going to hand over to Derek, who's going to explain a little bit more about that particular regulation.
Okay, so that regulation that Mel's talking about, 1223, it establishes rules to be complied with by any cosmetics product made available on the market. So it's covering anything, any cosmetics product that's available or will be available on the market. So it's built to ensure that functioning of the internal market and the high level of protection of human health. It's a really key point, human health. If you're establishing or you're creating a product, what's the impact on human health? And the standard 22716 now is the central pillar of that regulation, and it has wide-ranging or wide-reaching implications for the cosmetics businesses. So this is why 22716 is a little bit different to a lot of other standards. This has a very direct correlation with EU directives, and specifically this directive 1223.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, I remember we actually did a webinar on this particular standard, didn't we, when it first came out, and when the regulations came out. So could you just share with us a bit of background about how this began and, the kind of the purpose of it?
Well, it began Think of the exact dates, 21st of April 2011, 22716 officially become the European standard for GMP of cosmetics products. And it's built to ensure, key area here, of course, safety. The safety of the product, cosmetics product, placed in the European market. And it should be produced according to GMP, good manufacturing practice. So compliance with GMP is presumed where the manufacturer is in accordance with relevant harmonised standards and references that have been published in the official journal of the European Union. So leading on from that, the whole regulation, it came into effect in July 2013, with the European Community presenting a coordinated regulatory framework. So the laws of each of the respective nations must follow the regulation. This includes any relevant standards or guidance affecting the cosmetics industry. So 22716, that is the primary standard. But there are other guidance documents and other standards out there. The requirement applies to any cosmetics manufacturers outside the European Union. Now, this is what Mel was talking about earlier on. We've gone through Brexit, etc. But if you're a company that imports products into the countries within the region, the European region, then you need to meet these regulations. So it has a direct economic impact on you. So it's not a case of, we've left and we're following our own controls over here in GB. If you're exporting to Europe, you've got to meet with the regulations. And of course it makes perfect sense because we want to have safe products out on market shelves. So the regulation aims to utilise a uniform terminology as well as common procedures across the EU. So they're trying to join things together. So this is an example actually of good EU regulation.
Yeah, so who are the regulations actually applicable to then, Derek?
Right, well, it's applicable to all participants in the cosmetics product chain, European and non-European. Ingredients producers, products, final assemblers, distributors, importers, exporters. So quite a range of different people, organisations that it's applicable to. And 22716 gives that guidance for production and control and storage and shipment of cosmetics products. It deals with all aspects of the supply chain of cosmetics products. However, important part here, the standard actually does not cover safety aspects for personnel engaged in the plant. It covers safety of product, but not safety aspects of personnel engaged in the plant. We'd expect you to have your own systems in place. Mel touched, I think, on the previous presentation on ISO 45001, which is health and safety standard. We'd expect you to have some process in place. But this standard doesn't specifically talk about safety aspects for personnel engaged in the plant. It also does not cover protection for the environment, even though there is a clause 11, which talks about waste. But there again is correlation there with standards, for example, ISO 14001. You need to make sure that you're protecting that waste stream, but it doesn't specifically talk about the environment. In the future, when the standard gets updated, probably some of these will be made more robust, but that's for a future time. It's not applicable also for research and development activities. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't carry out research and development activities. And it's also not applicable for the distribution of the finished products. But again, within a process, you'll be distributing your product out to various shelves in various marketplaces.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think you touched on a couple of points there, Derek, that I would certainly like to see in an updated version of the standard. I think we have to remember that this standard was published in 2007
Yeah.
originally.
Yeah.
So, that was well over 20 years ago, and there have been so many changes since then. I mean, yes, there was a demand for organisations to act responsibly and do the right thing for our planet and the environment, but I don't think it's anywhere near like the demand there is today. And I think there is a huge obligation for all manufacturers, not just cosmetics manufacturing organisations, to consider the environmental footprint of their activities. So I'd love to be able to see that in the next version when that comes out. I know you would, definitely. But also quite surprisingly, actually, you mentioned that one of the things that it doesn't cover is the safety aspects for the personnel engaged in the plant. So although I guess under competency, you could say that is a company requirement, because ideally, if you're operating a manufacturing plant, you should have somebody that's NEBOSH qualified as a minimum as far as health and safety is concerned.
It sort of correlates and connects together, let's say. But the standard itself doesn't specifically say that. So.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously it does focus as one of the core principles is around safety of the product, as you mentioned at the very beginning. Maybe we should help out with the technical committee, volunteer our services based on knowledge of other standards. I'm sure there are some other ISO show listeners as well that would like to add their comments to the new version of the standard when that does come out. Talking about other standards, Derek, you did touch on the fact that, about linking with other standards. And I know that when we've spoken in the past offline, you've talked about the harmonisation of 22716 with other standards, and there are many other standards that there is that harmonisation potentially that could be derived from integration with other standards. Could you just share some insights into that for us?
Well, harmony with other standards. For instance, there's a two-part standard called ISO 16128. It's internationally coordinated technical guideline, and it's aimed at framing practices for cosmetics players within the industry. And interestingly here, because I think Mel touched on this before, the standard enables companies to agree on the definition of natural and organic. So obviously, nowadays there's a lot of information coming through and a lot of pressure coming through on natural organic products on the shelf. So these standards will connect with 22716. For instance, 16128 2016 version is the guidelines on technical definitions and the criteria, rather important here, for the natural organic cosmetics ingredients and products. So it gives you actual criteria for what those natural and organic cosmetics products and ingredients should be. In terms of ISO 16128-27, that describes the approaches to calculate the natural or natural origin or organic and organic origin indexes that apply to ingredients categories. So quite involved, quite detailed, but quite handy. Especially you're getting down to sort of micro level, let's say, on understanding what the ingredients are that you're producing. Continuing on, harmony with other standards. There's a standard there called Cosmos. Cosmos, standard for Cosmetics Organic and Natural Standard. And this standard's quite wide-ranging and reaching. It's been developed at the European and international level by BDIH from Germany, Cosmobuy and EcoCert from France, the ICEA from Italy, the AISBL, which is an international non-profit association registered in Belgium, and somebody or company here you would have heard of probably would be the Soil Association in the UK. And they were the founders of the Cosmos standard. So they were trying to define the common requirements and definitions for organic and natural cosmetics. And Cosmos has also announced the publication of version 3.1, which is a technical guide. And that was last published actually in September 2018. There might well be some newer versions of that coming through. But, these standards are quite handy to look at and source in relation to what your processes are.
Yeah, thanks for that, Derek. So lots of associations and leading players involved with the development of that. And we have to remember that whenever an ISO standard is created, it's not just one person that's making up, well, I think this would be good. As we know, there's a representation from across the globe, from leading bodies and authorities that know a heck of a lot about that particular subject. And it does take years to actually establish what good practice should look like. Could you provide an example in this particular case of some of the organisations that have been involved, with the development of ISO 22716?
Yeah, there's the content of 22716. It's been approved and accepted by many regulatory bodies around the world. So it's whether they were involved initially or not, they would accept the standard under their own criteria. For instance, the International Cooperation of Cosmetics Regulation, the ICCR, the Food and Drugs Administration, the FDA, the Japan Chemical Industry, and ASEAN, it's the ASEAN, Consultative Committee for Standards. So there's lots of different bodies and lots of different regulators out there that connect with this particular standard, 22716.
So as you mentioned earlier, Derek, the goods processed within the EU, within all of the countries within the EU, as well as all the imported cosmetics, it's affecting all of those different organisations. So it sounds as though there's an increased responsibility, both from the producers and the distributors, in all aspects really of cosmetics manufacturing. But are there any in particular that you'd like to mention?
Well, certainly regarding ingredients toxicity, really important. Product labelling, again, actually really important. So how good is your labelling on your products? How comprehensive is that labelling? A more comprehensive product file is required. Compulsory notification of a new product introduction into the European Commission. So there's an interesting area there. If you want to export to Europe, you've got to go through some of these details first to get your products approved. That can be quite time consuming, but you need to be aware of some of these requirements.
Yeah, so it's not as easy as you think, is it? No, not at all. And I know that something that's been a cause for debate, not just for cosmetics manufacturing products, but also in the food industry, is about the ingredients and labelling that are used. Could you just shine a light on this in particular for cosmetics?
Yeah, well, again, we probably return to two things really. Ingredients toxicity, put my teeth in. Ingredients toxicity, even. The ingredient selection is dictated by the regulation. It lays down all rules for product and ingredient safety assessments. It lists substances that must not be used owing to toxicity. Substances that can only be used in specified circumstances. Substances approved for the use in cosmetics like colouring agents and preservatives. So there's a lot, again, behind ingredients toxicity. In terms of product labelling, again, probably increasingly so, there's a strict set of rules for labelling of cosmetics products. And they need to be very visible on what's within the product. Otherwise, quite simply, the product will not be permitted onto the market. And cosmetics products should include information that explains how they are and how they are to be used.
That's great. Thanks, Derek. So again, that's just been a brief overview really on the cosmetics regulations, EC number 1223. 2009. So I know it's quite a dry subject for anybody really when it comes to regulations, but it's definitely one that we felt it was essential to share with you, because obviously this is the main driver behind the creation of ISO 22716 and why so many organisations across the globe have adopted this as their best practice mechanism for operating a cosmetics manufacturing facility and operation. So yeah, thanks very much for joining us once again, Derek.
Thank you, Mel.
But you're going to be back again soon.
Okay.
We're not letting you go whilst we're on the subject. The next episode is actually going to be covering the benefits of ISO 22716. And the first episode in this series, we talked about what ISO 22716 actually was. Obviously, in this episode, we've covered the main driver, which is the main EU directive. And actually, there are many other benefits, not just regulatory compliance. There are so many other benefits, which is definitely worthwhile exploring, both from an internal and an external perspective. So yeah, thanks once again for listening to Derek and I today, and we look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.